Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. So, who's funding Russia and their invasion in Ukraine? Well, would you be shocked if I told you that you may very well be one of those funders? Well, how could that be? You may ask, Tanya, that makes no sense. I do not donate to Russia's army. Well, are you aware that Russia is the third largest oil producer in the world? It's the second largest natural gas producer, and that Europe buys most of its natural gas from Russia. But Canada also buys products from Russia. In the last decade or so, we've purchased $3.6 billion worth of Russian oil. In the United States, for example, they import 585,000 barrels a day from Putin's regime. Is that shocking you? Well, we're going to discuss why and how we are potentially funding this invasion in Ukraine, and what Canada can do to perhaps get some independence from that Russian oil. And joining me now is Colin Craig, president of secondstreet.org, and Kris Sims, BC director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
Sure, for having me.
So, Colin, why don't you start by giving us a rundown on, I've thrown out some figures, but I'd love for you to expand on that. How much oil and gas is the world really buying from Russia?
Well, it's a lot. Russia makes up about 10% of the imported oil and gas that the world buys. So it's a very significant amount. I don't think it's insurmountable for the world to shift over time to purchasing less oil and gas from Russia. And this is an option especially available to Western nations that are wealthier and that in many cases have the resources to do it. The US has a lot of oil and gas that they could continue to produce. And certainly here in Canada, we have a lot of resources that we could start to produce and start exporting abroad.
So, Kris, were you surprised to hear about the quantity of oil that Canada's importing from Russia?
No, unfortunately, I wasn't surprised. I'm here in British Columbia, where we've had this loggerheads over our energy and our resources now for years and years. As you know, Kinder Morgan was trying to double its pipeline from Edmonton out to Burnaby, and they had so much foot dragging from the Trudeau government that they finally gave up and walked away and left taxpayers holding the bag. We now own the Trans Mountain Pipeline as it exists, and we're now on the hook and responsible for twinning it, which gets our oil and gas products both to the refinery in Burnaby, which we desperately need for supply, and enables us to ship more oil and gas out overseas. So, I'm in the epicenter of where this fight really is in BC. So unfortunately, I wasn't surprised we import so much.
Right. And now some might say, okay, well, 3.6 billion over several years, that's not that much. But it's something still. And, when we try and cry foul over Putin's invasion, well, we're also potentially funding it. So there's something to be said about that. I was recently at a conference, and one interesting point which was made was that the more that Putin, and maybe Colin, you can speak to this, the more that Putin goes to war, the higher the price of oil goes up, and he actually continues to enrich his country and perhaps some of those oligarchs who are making hand over fist with the rising cost of oil. Did you want to expand?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. That is a problem, is that the price of oil is shooting up quite substantially right now. And because Putin continues to sell oil and gas resources to the world, he's benefiting from it. So I think that the challenge is that in the short term, a lot of countries can't simply turn off the taps and stop importing from Russia. Canada's amount that we import, it's not a huge amount, so it's easier for us to do it. It's a bit harder for the United States, where Russian oil makes up about 7% of their imports. In Europe, as you mentioned earlier, Tanya, it's a huge amount of natural gas that Europe imports. It's, I believe, upwards of around 40%. So you're not turning on a dime if you're Europe to stop purchasing Russian oil and gas. You need alternatives, and I think that's where Canada can play a part.
And I think it's important on a geopolitical perspective to see how much energy actually factors into this I guess war, in this conflict, because when you see that a country like Germany, for example, is so beholden to Russian energy, they may think twice before putting up higher sanctions or joining or encouraging NATO to go in and take action, because there will be real consequences, not just for Russia, not just for Ukraine, but also for example, the German people.
For sure. And actually, we've seen that in the early days of the invasion. The West responded with all kinds of different sanctions. And in many cases, they wouldn't actually stop importing oil and gas. And that's because it's very difficult to do so in the short term.
Okay, we're going to pick up this discussion when we return in just a few moments. Stick around. Welcome back. I'm joined by Kris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and Colin Craig, President of SecondStreet.org. And we're talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how energy is factoring into that conflict. We know that when President Biden took office, he canceled the Keystone XL, which was sort of this final bolt in a coffin for Canadian exporting their oil. It was so important to have that going. In doing so, though, we also realized that Russia, again, the United States imports 585,000 barrels a day from Russian oil. What's going on here, Kris? Was Canadian oil just simply not good enough that they'd rather just import from Russia than from their friendly neighbors to the north?
That's a great question. Ultimately, it is mostly politics. If the Americans don't know that they're importing oil and gas from a place like Russia, but they very visibly can see that they're importing oil and gas from a place like Canada, which is got lots of activists from all sides of the spectrum, and it's physically right there, and it's geographically centered, and you can protest right at it. It's much harder to push that back. We here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation a couple of years ago, we did a study, and it's something to the tune of $13 billion just in federal income taxes that we are losing out on in Canada because we don't have pipeline capacity. So no matter what's going through it, it could be magic dust. We're losing out on around $13 billion. That's real money that could be going to schools and hospitals. So this is a very serious issue. When you make energy unaffordable for people, a lot of average working people really suffer.
And again, this has become a vicious cycle. Energy is now becoming very unaffordable. It always has been increasing in its inaffordability. We've seen sticker signs at the pumps in California hitting $7 a gallon. Obviously, BC, crazy high rates per liter. On the West Coast, even in Ontario, many people are shocked to know that there was, again, another spike in rates, some places well over $1.70 a liter. Shocking, especially in just a short time when things were, in a bit more of a normal range. Kris, we have many people look at the pump and say, okay, well, that's carbon tax. But no, I think it has to do also with us importing, for example, the cost of oil going up and we're importing it. How much does the carbon tax factor in on something like this?
It does factor in. Here in BC, for example, yes, of course, what's happening overseas is affecting the actual price of oil. But here in Metro Vancouver, for example, it's around 72 cents a liter of that is taxes. And about 27 cents of that is carbon taxes. It costs about $20 extra to fill up a family minivan just in carbon taxes in Vancouver. So that's nothing to sneeze at. And our average cost at the pump right now is $2 a liter for regular.
So, Colin, I'll ask you this question, and Kris, you can jump in as well. Going back again to President Biden, his canceling of Keystone XL. Yes, I know politics is at play. Pretty much anything is determined by politics these days. But practically now, I see that there is an opportunity if the world wanted to, or if North America wanted to get off Russian oil or any oil, even from Saudi oil, this is an opportunity to really open the pipeline. I think that Joe Biden would have popular support if he were to say, okay, we're going to get off Russian oil dependence. We're going to open up Keystone instead. That's the trade-off. Do you think Canada would have an appetite for that? Do you think there's a national North American appetite for something like that right now?
I think there is, if you tune into the images that we're seeing from Ukraine, they're just appalling what Putin is doing in that nation. Kids huddled together in bomb shelters, a young couple getting married and then grabbing arms so that they can defend their country the same day. It's appalling. That is the end result of the world buying oil from Putin's Russia. That needs to change. It cannot continue, even if Putin pulled out today. We cannot be buying oil from this man in the future. So we have the resources here in Canada. We're a country with a stellar environmental track record. We could be producing those resources and exporting them. I think the challenge is politically, we have a number of politicians that have sort of wrapped themselves in the issue of climate change. And so it becomes a little challenging for them to suddenly increase oil and gas production. But we can't forget that when we do increase especially exports of natural gas, that can be a very, very good thing for the environment. When we get natural gas to countries like China and other nations that are using coal right now, when they use natural gas instead, that can help bring down their emissions by about 50%. So this can be a very good thing for the environment if Canada starts to export more.
And if we say that we stand so well and hold our heads up high on environmental records and human rights records, why wouldn't we want to be leading the production of these things rather than, again, importing it from Russia, Saudi, and all these other countries? Well, we're going to continue this discussion when we return in just a few moments. Stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing the Russia-Ukraine conflict from a oil and gas perspective. Russia is a global leader in production of oil and gas, and many, many countries swallow it up, including Canada, including you and me. Joining me again is Colin Craig and Kris Sims. Colin, NATO a few years ago suggested that Russia was engaged in global espionage, and for some that might be okay, big shock, nobody's surprised there. But in terms of supporting eco-terrorism or eco-activists to make sure that other pipelines within Europe or other projects were not going to proceed, therefore, it suggests to me that they're giving Russia an upper hand on their oil and gas exports. Could you expand on that and let me know, do you think something like that could have happened here on Canadian soil? Were Russians interfering with our Canadian pipeline development?
Yeah, so I mean, Putin's regime, they're pretty smart. They realize that if they can take out their competition when it comes to oil and gas sales, that can help the Russian economy. So what they've done is they've funded environmental groups in other countries, especially democracies, so that they could build public opposition to developing oil and gas in those nations and try to pressure politicians not to do so. And so the former Secretary General of NATO has warned about this. He said this was happening in Europe. Russia was funding groups to oppose natural gas development in Europe, and that would keep Europe dependent on Russia for to continue to buy oil and gas. And we also heard from both Democrats and Republicans in the United States saying the same thing was happening in Russia, or pardon me, in the United States. Russia was funding these environmental groups. It said that Russia was they created sort of a shell organization in Bermuda. They flow the money down to Bermuda, and then the Bermuda entity would fund environmental groups up in the United States. So if it's happening in those countries, it certainly seems plausible that it could be happening in Canada. We know that environmental groups in Canada have been receiving money from abroad. It's not clear if they received any from Russia, but ultimately, I think our elected officials can't be naive when they consider these issues, and they should be putting Canada and our industry first.
What a disastrous, but at the same time, ingenious plan for Russia to try to wipe out its competition. And to think that could have happened or could be happening here on Canadian soil is indeed shocking. Kris, does it shock you what you just heard, that perhaps Russia is funding some of these eco-radicals who are hell-bent on shutting down our Canadian oil and gas sector?
When you're dealing with something in the billions and trillions of dollars and lots of powerful countries internationally, nothing would really surprise me. But when it comes down to Canada, I think it comes back down to accountable government. Ultimately, we are responsible for holding our elected officials to account here in Canada. So if we don't like what we're hearing, if it's rumors about disinformation, if it's importing Russian oil, no matter what the issue is, it's up to us to hold these members of parliament accountable. And so that means that we have to be active citizens. We have to be emailing them. We have to be phoning them. We have to be watching the testimony that's happening at committee on Parliament Hill, because nothing's going to change if we don't threaten them with losing an election. If a politician thinks that they're going to lose the next election, they smarten up real quick and they listen very carefully. So if we don't like $2 a liter gas, we better be able to hold these politicians' feet to the fire and hold them to account. And I also want to warn here, we also need to be able to express ourselves fully online, and we need to be really careful about Bill C-11. That's the old Bill C-10. That is the Trudeau government's attempt to gag what we can say on the internet and what we can share with each other. So we have to be careful here with the allegations of disinformation. We can't allow the state to decide what we're able to say on the internet.
Okay, so that's a bit of a tangent. I will do a whole show on that. But on that note, are you suggesting then persons actively promoting the detachment or the independence from Russia oil could be potentially censored if this bill passes?
Who knows, right? If you give the government that kind of power, how do you walk it back in? And this proves the point of, if you like what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau thinks and says right now, and you think it's awesome, and you agree with him, and you want Bill C-11 to go through, what happens when the government changes and you no longer like how the Prime Minister thinks and what the bureaucracy thinks? Then you're on the other side of the equation. And again, that's why we need free and open expression online.
Okay, and to that point, you are correct that a main theme of the Justin Trudeau government has been, promoting green energy, the building back better through green renewal, and obviously we haven't had pipelines built. We're stuck. We can't get the product out. We can't go west. We can't go east. We can't go south. So I could see what you're saying. Your point that if you're presenting something contra to that under C-11, you could very well get caught up under that bill. We're going to pick up this discussion when we come back in just a few moments. Stick around, please. Welcome back. Are you concerned that you may be funding the conflict in Russia, Ukraine through your purchasing of oil and gas? Well, that could very well be happening since Canada does import oil from Russia. And joining me to wrap up this discussion is Colin Craig, president of secondstreet.org, and Kris Sims, BC director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Kris, we've talked about a lot of problems on this program of importing Russia oil and Europe's dependence on Russia oil and gas, and the canceling of the Keystone, and so many pipelines that just should be built and haven't been built, and the carbon tax and green energy activists. So what's the solution? How do we get out of this? What can we do to A, help the Ukraine-Russia conflict end sooner, and B, how do we stop buying Russian oil in Canada?
Well, it's a great question. I'm sure that there are international experts and energy experts smarter than I am who can answer the two main elements of that. When it comes down to the Taxpayers Federation, we really get calls on affordability. And of course, the affordability of energy is absolutely essential. If you can't afford to drive to work or to heat your home or to buy groceries because the carbon taxes are so bloody high, that's a very serious issue. And so that's why, again, we are calling for both the Trudeau government federally and the Horgan government here in BC to scrap the carbon taxes. Here in BC, that would save $20 every single time you're filling up your minivan. It's serious money right now with the carbon taxes. And Prime Minister Trudeau is using us as a template for the rest of Canada. Within the next 8 years, it's going to cost you more than 50 cents a liter in carbon taxes. That's serious money. Yeah.
So if you've seen the price rise at the pumps, well, it's only going to go higher the longer A, this conflict goes on, and B, as the carbon taxes increase.
They want that to be the norm. You see the $2 per liter signs coming out of Vancouver. The federal government wants that to be the norm across Canada without a conflict overseas.
My goodness. Colin, I'll throw the question back to you. How can we as Canadians, how can the Canadian government help end this conflict sooner through our oil and gas sector?
Well, as we've talked about, Canada has the resources that could help offset a good chunk of the purchases that other countries are making of Russian oil and gas. Our issue is we need to develop it. We need to have pipeline capacity so that we can export it. And then that can help other countries have another choice instead of having to buy from Russia. Now, I think that the political reality is that we have a number of elected officials in this country who have built up their brands around fighting climate change. So it becomes a little bit challenging for them to suddenly start agreeing to producing more oil and gas. But I think the solution is, yes, we make it so we can develop and export more oil and gas, not only for use in Canada, but for exporting abroad. But at the same time, what governments could commit to doing is taking the tax revenues from those new projects and using them to fund environmental initiatives that reduce carbon dioxide and other emissions. So you kind of have the ethical Canadian oil component that other countries can purchase. And at the same time, you'd see the environmental aspect of this that other countries don't have. So that could come in the form of using the money to pay companies that take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And Tanya, you and I talked about this before. how there's a lot of companies in the world that are doing really cool things to take CO2 and make useful products out of it. So we
Right.
could
We
pay
actually
them.
talked about one that was taking CO2 to make vodka, which is another major export of Russia. Not that again, I'm not trying to be uber political here, but if there's a concern about funding Russia, well, oil, vodka, I think there's some options here.
I think there certainly are. And there's a way that we can do this in an environmentally friendly way that also helps with the geopolitical challenge that we're facing. And that challenge is not going to go away. 5, 10 years from now, we do not want to be buying Russian oil, especially if Vladimir Putin is still heading that nation.
Okay, we only have a minute left, but again, not to get too philosophical here, but does Canada then do we actually have an ethical leg to stand on if we're decrying what Russia's doing to Ukraine, and Justin Trudeau is flying over there having these peace negotiation talks, trying to lend his voice to that discussion, when there are solutions we could be doing here in our land of Canada to stop funding this war?
I think
Colin?
certainly we can. I mean, the first thing is to stop buying Russian oil and gas. The second thing is to be the supplier of choice for the rest of the world. And I think that's very much doable.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much both for being on today. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Having me.
So clearly in Canada, there are many things that we can be doing domestically without even stepping foot outside of our borders to help the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But if we don't build those pipelines and we don't get our oil and gas out, we will not be part of that solution. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.